the next panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be absolutely interesting. It's a wonderful topic that I think you'll all want to listen to. The topic for this panel discussion will be Indian higher education is overly influenced by the West. I'd like to immediately welcome our chairperson, Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam, Dean Planning and Development, Shastra University, to please make his way onto the stage. We also have with us Ms. Amita Sharma, Additional Secretary, Technical, Department of Higher Education, MHRD, Mr. S. Gurumurthy, Co-Convener, Swadeshi Jagran Manch, and Ms. Savita Mahajan, Deputy Dean, ISB. Once again, a very quick overview about the details of the panel discussion. The chairperson will begin by making his address. Moving forward, each of the speakers will make their presentation either through a PowerPoint slide or will speak from where they're seated. Post that, there will be a group discussion amongst them, and then we'll have the Q&A with all of you in the last 5 minutes. I now hand over the proceedings to the chairperson. Over to you, sir.
Very distinguished co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely happy to kickstart this second session for this year's version of ThinkEDU. The tagline for the conclave is Schooling India for Tomorrow. And for those who attended ThinkEDU in 2013, including myself, we still can recall the concerning voice of Mr. Prabhuchala when he said that the problems of education in India needs to be discussed by Indians because it can be understood only by Indians who can prescribe an Indian model that can provide a very good solution to the existing problems. And I can understand the reasons why he chose this topic, that Indian higher education is overly influenced by West. Now, before I set the context for this panel discussion, let me also qualify the term West. Generally, the understanding is the geographical affiliation. But for the purpose of this panel discussion, it is beyond the geography. It is an idea, a unification of idea which has two extremes, the Western and the Eastern. By West, it hence means the USA, Canada, UK, some parts of Europe, and also some countries which are not geographically in the West. Take, for example, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, to a certain extent, Japan, but still are unified by a common set of ideas. And we'll restrict that for the purpose of education. And contrary to that is also some of those countries which are actually in the West but have a different idea. Most of the Latin American countries and of course Russia. So you have a set of countries which are geographically aligned in the western part of the globe but have a different idea altogether. So I thought I will just qualify the term West that way. Now I would like to just begin laying down the context by referring to a paper written by Professor Benoy Kumar Sarkar, a professor from the National Council of Education in Bhopal. And this paper, ladies and gentlemen, is a part of his lecture that he delivered in Columbia University in 1918. And this was published in the Journal of Race Development in 1918. He starts his paper tracing the evolution of modern civilization, which according to him was in 1776 after Adam Smith wrote his book Wealth of Nations. And he says that that was the time that actually the world underwent a great transformation. And that led to the Industrial Revolution, which changed the architecture of the global order. And India's intimacy with the West also began at that point of time. And in our celebration of the Occidental arrival, we forgot the Oriental contribution, and that was the essence of his paper. I thought I will just read a few lines which leaves a very profound message. He says, it goes without saying that the achievements of the Occidental world in industry, science, philosophy, and the fine arts during the 19th century have profoundly influenced the thoughts and activities of the people of India as of other regions in Asia. But what is most likely to be missed by the student of culture history is the fact that even the ancient and medieval civilization of the Hindus, he meant India, has been one of the feeders of this modern civilization itself. That is, that the cultural movements in Europe and America since 1776 have been affected to an appreciable extent by the achievements of free India down to that period. And he gives two examples. One was on the naval architecture as to how we had advanced technologies in shipbuilding that other nations queued up in the coastal regions of India and got their ships manufactured. But that apart, what is significantly important is the so-called pedagogy. And he goes on to say that during the formative period of the modern educational systems, also in Europe and America, the pedagogy of the Hindus, especially on its elementary side, has played an important part. So he writes in this paper that even the primary education at that point of time, there was something that India actually gave to the world, and that is why his paper was titled The Influence of India on Western Civilization in Modern Times. He says it is well known that primary education was grossly neglected in America during the first half of our independence. In England, even so late as 1843, 32% of the men and 49% of the women had to sign their names on the marriage register with a cross. Illiteracy was the rule in France. The ignorance was general, and that all the teachers did not know how to write. In an age of paucity of public schools, private educational efforts naturally elicited the people's admiration, and none drew more sympathy and support than Andrew Bell, who writes a detailed paper on mutual tuition or pupil-teacher or monitorial system of school management, our Gurukul system. And he writes so much in that paper, but what is more important is this. He asks this question: what is the origin of this much applauded mutual instruction or monitorial system, the so-called Bell-Lancastrian discovery in pedagogy? And he gives the answer. Historians of education are familiar with the fact that the plan of making one boy teach others has been indigenous to India for centuries. And Bell himself, in his Mutual Tuition, the paper, describes how in Madras, he came into contact with a school conducted by a single master through the medium of scholars themselves. And in fact, in England, the monitorial system or the method of making every boy at once a master and a scholar is known as the Madras system. And this, the Westminster Abbey records and says the eminent founder of the Madras system of education, which has been adopted within the British Empire as the national system of education for the children of poor. And how many of us sitting here in this hall know about this? That we as a nation, we have contributed something to the world outside in primary education. And many of you know our contribution in the higher education space as well. The Nalanda University, the Takshashila. Today we talk about the choice-based credit system and all that. There were times in Takshashila and Nalanda where all sorts of courses were studied by everybody. You had 10,000 teachers, 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. Your ratio was 1:5, and today we are talking about 1:15. We had better ratios at that point of time. So there is enough scientific evidence to prove that the West actually is indebted to India. And this was just one such example that I wanted to actually present to this audience. So I strongly believe that there has been a series of transformations happening in the higher education, in education in general. that we were a country of makers actually. We made education. We were the makers of education. Then came the Industrial Revolution, which actually shook. That was the shakers of the education. And then constant policy making that always told us that we were lacking something, that we are lackers actually. And hence, we need a system that is external to hack our system, hackers of education. Look what's happened now. From being makers, shakers, lackers, and now hackers. And that's why I've written so much on this policy making on foreign education, the introduction of foreign universities. I've said that it is a toxic pill. Why do we need to prescribe that pill? Besides my toxicology of the article, I want to understand the pathology of the policy making at the ministry level as to why are we actually intellectually insubordinating ourselves to a system that somebody believes is the only cure that can actually provide solutions to the problems? Or do we have indigenous models within ourselves, an indigenous intellect that can provide solutions that our country is facing in the stream of higher education? That's one of probably the questions that the panel will also answer. There is also another belief that, countries that are economically very sound have better educational systems in place. If that's the question, aren't we a country that has tremendous economic potential that can provide world-class educational solutions to the problems that we have in hand? So this, I thought, will be the context that I wanted to set, and we have a list of eminent speakers for this panel discussion. Mr. S. Gurumurthy, who I think will provide the indigenous intellect that is required. Dr. Savita Mahajan, the Deputy Dean from the Indian School of Business, which has 2 campuses here, but also has some roots to some of the best business schools outside India as well, so we can also understand what best practices from the West that the ISB is also trying to get. And Ms. Amita Sharma from the MHRD. And from her, I would like to know actually what is the DNA of the policy making. Because I'm very concerned that, we are probably lost in the policy making endeavor. I told you this stream of makers, shakers, lackers, and hackers. Now, what's in the mind of the policy makers? And I am very, very happy that the New Indian Express has gotten together to put a very good panel like this. And picking on from where Mr. Prabhuchala left, I would just like to conclude with Noam Chomsky's comment on the purpose of education. He said we need to educate people to bring them to a particular point from which they can think on their own. So with this question, ladies and gentlemen, I first invite Ms. Amita Sharma.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very privileged to be here, to be part of this discussion here, and I want to particularly compliment the organizers of the ThinkEDU Conclave for a very thought-provoking question that they're posing, in particular for this session. It's a very vast and complex subject, and I don't think 10 minutes can quite do justice to the many layers of interpretation on this. There isn't also very adequate research on this as yet. So I'm going to share with you not really the DNA of a policy make, which is also extremely complex, and let's not simplify that, but I'm going to present to you my take on it and the work that I'm involved in right now, which is actually engaged with the kind of questions you just raised right now. So it'll be more like sort of sharing with you certain forms of work where we're seeking to address the kind of questions that are being raised in this session. And of course, it'll be only a glimpse, and we can carry the discussion on later on. So to summarize much of what has been said right now by the chair, and you can hardly deny that, is why do children know, why do we know more about Pythagoras, Archimedes, Galileo, Newton? Why don't we know enough about Panini or Aryabhat or Bhaskaracharya? Why do we read Homer and Dickens, and why don't we actually read the Panchatantra and the Jatak or the Indian epics as part of our mainstream educational discourse? I think that what this is really doing is it's premised in certain very fundamental epistemological and axiological assumptions, this kind of a question, because it's actually, in a way, it's saying that what is knowledge is determined by how knowledge is constructed. In that, the custodians of knowledge construction legitimize the knowledge they construct into truth, fact, value, create a whole sense of identity. And all this obviously very intimately linked with the issues of power, control of resources, and hegemony. I think we do concede that we have in India undergone a great cultural amnesia of our own knowledge systems. And the reasons are very well known. They're both colonial, and they're also very dangerously, very post-colonial coloniality as well, which is often not sufficiently deconstructed. And we continue to re-legitimize all of this through increasingly modern and progressive tools. And there is a session, I think the next day on one of them, which is on issues of how do you rank and how do you grade your own educational institutions. We have a whole lot of work in that, and I'd be very happy to share that with anybody else who's interested in that. And so that only helps you forget what you are or where you came from, and continues to superimpose on that an identity which is quite alien. This is obviously very, very evident in forms of education like literature and history, which are very dominant in their content. So the text becomes very dominating there. But actually, it's more subtly and more insidiously present in what are apparently culture-neutral subjects like science and technology, and basic engineering as well. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the fact, and much of this, since Anna Hazare himself inaugurated this, he himself is a living legend on how he's interrogated most imported forms of technology in Raleigh. So all of us are familiar with the fact that the way we started to build our roads, the birth of engineering institutions in India itself, roads building, water management, all of that has been automatically been governed by knowledge and research data systems and technology which do not belong to this country, not its soil, not its water, not its conditions of construction. So they've been very fragile in their in what has been built up. Just two very quick examples of that, for example, is the roads, the building of the national highway when they started off were completely imported technologies, and the current IIT director of Patna, Mr. Bhaumik, actually is responsible to a large extent of the research he did in IIT Kharagpur on dealing with polymers so that the road signs didn't wear off. So this kind of work is still very, very new and going on. A very interesting anecdote which I learned from a colleague of mine in IIT Delhi, he's a professor there, who was working on ancient dams, and you're looking at the dams in Kaveri River. His narrative is that the Britishers couldn't understand that kind of a dam because most the dams we've imported from the West are for slow-moving rivers, not for fast-moving rivers, and are not subject to heavy sedimentation. So when the Britishers saw the dam over Kaveri, they couldn't understand it. It had fallen into disuse because of the fight between two kingdoms, one that had the dam and one that had the material and the labor. And between the two fights, the Britishers came in and then built 8 dams across that river. You can see them now. And they were all built on wrong principles, because they were not built on principles of the fact that rivers in India sediment. So, of course, Raleigh City, where energy works, which I have seen when I was doing my job in the Rural Development Ministry, is a whole text of what kind of indigenous knowledge you can have. In my own experience, when I was had to do water harvesting and dig wells, was largely built on local community knowledges rather than just instruments we were importing there. So this is evident in experience. It's now getting increasingly documented as well. But then, and that's the second part of my presentation, is what do we do about these isolated and, let's say, not mainstream knowledge and experience, and how do we actually convert them into and integrate them with the mainstream education that institutions of higher education offer? I'm again here going to limit my example to the technical institutions, to the IITs that I work with, and where we've started off certain innovative ways in which we can harness some of this knowledge, some of this engagement and research in the form of research with these indigenous knowledge systems and what's relevant to the country, and integrate them into mainstream curriculum so that the next generation of people who lead this country are better informed. I mentioned 3 of these innovations to you. The first one is this whole new emphasis on a more driving emphasis on locating engineering and technology in the local context and the local communities to look for sustainable solutions. I'm happy to draw your attention to the fact that this is is manifest in several centers of research coming up in the IITs. I'm going to mention a few of them. There is a Center for for Appropriate Technologies in Rural Areas at the Sitara in IIT Bombay. They're also beginning to work on frugal technologies, and this is again about how to look at local problems, find appropriate technologies, and then work that through rather than impose unnecessary and expensive methods. And then you have the Center for Urban Science and Engineering, again in IIT Bombay, working on urban design. You have, we actually had a long discussion with, let's say, even DMI CDC, that's a Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which is currently importing a lot of technologies in the way it's designed for smart cities, the future. And they're actually opening the offer up to all the IITs to come up with local sustainable solutions matching the demand for high-level technologies. So this is where you're trying to integrate current, modern, progressive demands with local interpretations and adaptations of technologies as well. There are many such centers, and you have the whole Rural Development Center in IIT Kharagpur, which is doing very fascinating research. It's part of their mainstream research. You have Vinod Thare, who many of you may know, who's working on water and sanitation issues in IIT Kanpur. The whole building of the new IIT Jodhpur is built on an understanding of the step well in the Barbary system as architectural principle, because it's a water scarce area. So they're actually practicing the kind of engineering that they want to teach, and it's built on understanding traditional technologies. So these is, of course, again, very, very small things, but then we are trying very hard to make them more and more embedded with what we call mainstream course curriculum. One of the ways of doing that is a totally new initiative, which we call Sandhi. This is an anagram for Science and Heritage Initiative. Just been started off. We've had about a couple of workshops, and one of the lead institutions on this is IIT Kanpur. For anybody of you who want to go and meet up with them, you can take the contacts from me from our website. They have a fascinating proposal, and these are all, as I'm admitting, these are all very innovative curricular reform and revamp efforts. So what the whole purpose of Sandhi is to try to conjoin again the culture and education. And it works through looking at traditional text, technology, lab experiments, and applications for impact on contemporary problems. So you're not really glorifying something of the past just because you have a memory towards the past. You're actually trying to demonstrate its feasibility right now. So it is knowledge which is in pareness. They looked at 5 streams on that. They're going to create a center for resources for studying indigenous texts and their applications. And that includes things like, for example, water systems. They're looking at the Kalinger hydrological systems right now and the Bundela systems right now. They're looking at the whole work on steel and iron, which is really very, very prominent in the Rasayan methods of India, the traditional chemical sciences. So that's on the material science front. They're looking at how classical, like for example, Indian musical instruments, classical instruments, and looking at the studying Indian musical instruments to then go back, rebuilt on the C.V. Raman papers, etc., building them into live experiments and leading on to study of acoustic sounds and strings. So that's about, then the third area they're looking at is the climatic and seismic environment and mapping them for the Harappan sites of Gujarat, including trade, language, and so on and so forth. They're looking at documentation of heritage structures to integrate this junction between culture, heritage, education. We must remember that the Britishers actually spent 5% on the ASI budget. We now spend only 1% on the ASI budget. So if you don't actually valorize your own educational forms as a community, how will that get into your textbooks? Why will your children do that? And interestingly enough, they're looking at the Nyaya Vaisheshik system to study the whole theory of atoms and that. So this is the Sandhi initiative. There are many, many more layers. Shortage of time, I can't go into all of them. Then, to kind of pull all these strings together, we also just come up with a new design manifesto with the, I'll close in 2 minutes. In the design manifesto, where you're looking at also, at the integration of the aesthetic sensibility with the reticular sensibility, because that is what makes you appreciate education as an experience as well as an analytical tool. And the design manifesto is again on our website, and it's the whole purpose in that is to look at that which you would not normally look at, start constructing and orient your production tools towards what the community needs, especially those who are at the bottom of that. There's a whole emphasis, for example, in reviving crafts by a better understanding of traditional technologies and modernizing them for better productivity. So it should be a win-win for everyone. It should not just become a museum piece. The next point I want to make here is that it's not just about transforming the object of learning, it's also about creating a pedagogy or critical consciousness. I totally agree with you, because if you just study an ancient text for the purpose of an ancient text, you can get quite dogmatic, as you can be equally dogmatic about progressive texts. So we need to get outside the dogma of inane ideologies, and the only way to do that is how the Leelavati, for example, is an excellent example of how you, right from a very early age, you can teach the mind to analyze from your own experience. Finally, again, it's not either or. Excellence is everywhere. Please remember that actually it was Prinsep in the 19th century who drew our attention to the Ashokan texts and the scripts. We were all lying in disuse before that. And Bhartrihari himself said that what does he know? Only knows his own tradition. So we need to have the confidence to be good on our own turf, on our own terms, dictate terms to the world, but also not simply make it parochial and reduce our connection with the larger world, because excellence is universal. And hence, and actually the whole point that if you do understand your local context, then you can go very big, because you have critical consciousness to determine the terms of your debate. I'll close here, and all the work I did in my school education days in the state of Madhya Pradesh was all a very happy demonstration that children and teachers know when they're taught in their own language about their own environment, and they can move from those particularities actually to generalizing as knowledge principles. So what is true for schools is equally true for these higher education institutions. So that is not exactly the DNA of a policy, but that's a kind of a social essays, kind of genetically, again, reorienting it towards the kind of issues you've raised. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you very much, Ms. Amita Sharma. She briefly shared the various ministry initiatives and also bordered on the very important subject of pedagogy and how it either needs to be an enlightenment model or probably the currently followed indoctrination model, and she perfectly understands the need to actually adopt to the former. Now I would request Dr. Savita Mahajan to take over the proceedings.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Savita Mahajan from the Indian School of Business. I have no intentions whatsoever to talk about ISB this afternoon. I think the issues we are addressing are far larger than that. I just want to start by laying out the sort of complete landscape and ecosystem, if you like, of the higher education system anywhere. Somebody made a comment this morning about, also emphasizing skill development and skills training. So I see higher education as two parts. One is very clearly around skill development, training, and as Mr. Mittal mentioned this morning, maybe that ought to start somewhere in school itself, whether it's class 9, 10, but people should have a choice of getting themselves skilled and trained in employable sort of sectors. But to me, education is different from skilling. And I want to now focus on, the sort of other aspect of education. Fortunately, we are all agreed, I think, on what the purpose of higher education should be. And in different ways, people have tried to put that forward. What we want is to create citizens, not only for the nation, but for the world, who are well-rounded, well-informed, have the right values, understand not just themselves and their needs, but understand others, are tolerant of diversity, have some sort of value system ingrained in them for service and, of course, ultimately sacrifice, as Annaji said this morning. What is the best way to impart this kind of education? To me, there are three aspects to addressing this whole issue. One is purpose. And while I've outlined what I think the purpose should be, I do think that irrespective of how good our education system was centuries ago, certainly in the last 60 years, we have lost it, we have ignored it, and I don't think our higher education or even lower education system is educating people for this purpose and these values. The second part of the whole issue is the structure of the higher education system. And the third part is the curriculum or pedagogy or whatever else you may like to call it. While the third is important, I, at least in the next 8-9 minutes, will not address that. Again, not because it's not important, but I want to say a few things about the structure of higher education. So there are 3 stages in higher education, and here I'm talking about 12 plus. So I'm assuming that school is 10 plus 2. There's undergraduate education, there is postgraduate education, and then there is doctoral and, sort of the highest level of education. I think we need to understand what is the purpose of each of these 3 levels and what is the best way to deliver, that education. What have we done so far in the last 60 years? What has gone right? What has gone wrong? And in that restructuring process, is there anything we can learn from anywhere? Forget about East, West, South, even our own, experience, let's say a century ago. Let me just take each of these briefly. To me, undergraduate education should be broad-based, multidisciplinary, should inculcate critical reasoning, logical thinking, problem solving, communication, articulation, and leave the person at the end of that process with the tools and the ability to be a continuous learner. Does our undergraduate system currently work towards this? Unfortunately not. I think what has happened in our case is, and more so even from the time I did my undergrad, which is now close to 35 years, we have taken specialization earlier and earlier. Not only is it now not at the undergraduate level, in class 8, we ask our children to make a choice whether they want to do science or humanities, whether they want to do political science or psychology or sociology. To my mind, it's completely dysfunctional and not the way to go. I think our undergraduate system should be for this broad-based education. At least in the first 2 years, children should learn, or young adults by then, should have an exposure to multiple disciplines. They can choose among many, but I think they are more well-rounded if they have some sense of history, some sense of, politics, some sense of, where the world is going, etc. So I think in terms of undergraduate education, we do need to make a change in the structure, in our curriculum, everything. Let's now come to postgraduate education. Interestingly, and I think wrongly, in India, the best postgraduate education actually happens outside of universities. It's quite amazing to me as I look back now that we would have let this happen. You look at all our so-called good or high-ranked postgraduate educational institutions, whether they are in engineering, management, or anything else for that matter, biology, statistics. These are all institutions that have been set up either as autonomous or through an act of parliament or whatever. And of course, you know, I'm referring to the IITs and the IIMs and TIFR and TIS. They don't sit in the university system. They all sit outside. And as a result, over the years, I think our university system, with due respects to, you know, anybody here in this room who's trying their best to, you know, make something out of a bad situation, we have neglected our universities. We have underfunded them. We have almost treated them like stepchildren, quite frankly. Let's come to the third part, which is the doctorate level, which is where cutting edge, you know, the boundaries of knowledge are pushed, which is where some people from the postgraduate level, those who are not doing professional courses and are doing basic disciplines, will graduate to do research and to further the knowledge. To my mind, again, this is an area where universities should have focused, should focus. In fact, public universities. You know, one of the things I find over the last many years as I go to many of these forums, and there is so much talk about, you know, private entry into higher education, I think one thing which people don't realize is that research is a public good. Any private player who's going to enter higher education for profit has no incentive to focus on research, because research is a public good which needs to be funded publicly. I think our public universities need to be funded for research, for doctoral work, because only then will we get a pool of well-trained faculty who will then be available for our higher education. I mean, one of the, you know, biggest challenges in higher education today, also for private players, there are no faculty. There are no well-trained faculty. And I, you know, again, hesitate to say this, but our university system, by and large, is not producing, you know, research-driven or research-taught faculty members, which is a must for our higher educational system. We cannot, at the end of the day, separate teaching from research for very long. You cannot have an excellent teaching outfit without research happening simultaneously. So I think these things need to be linked together. So my understanding of the structure in the Western system, and here I'm referring to mostly North American system, which I think we can learn from. In the North American system, after 12 school, there is an option for a student to go to what is called a community college, which is for 2 years. This is for students who cannot make it directly into a university for whatever reason. These are institutions that are focused on teaching, and therefore they are less expensive. People who want to prepare themselves for an ultimate university education have an opportunity to go through 2 years of a community college and then get admitted into a university. Of course, if you're capable and are able to afford the kind of education, you go straight from class 12 to a university system. And then in the university itself, all universities are multidisciplinary. I mean, there is no university that I know of in the North American system that would be only a engineering university or only a management university. I think by definition, they are all multidisciplinary. They provide undergraduate education, they provide postgraduate education, they provide doctoral education. preparing and generating faculty is a very critical part of the university's outcome. So they're really an integrated whole serving the higher education need.
Dr. Mahajan?
Yes, please. Yes. So if that is what is understood as a Western system, I don't think we are adopting it. I think we would be better off if we adopted it, at least as far as the structure is concerned. I'm not saying we have to copy everything from curriculum to pedagogy and all that, but I think there's something to be learned from the structure of higher education in the Western system. And I, for one, feel that the sooner we adopt it, the better off we are. Another critical element of that system, by the way, is the transferability of credits between a community college and a university, between universities, the ability to move from one functional discipline to another without getting tied to it at the age of 15 and not being able to make any change for the rest of your life. I think these are some very beneficial points in the Western system which we should adopt. I think we will be better off for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for laying down three models, the modularity approach, purpose, structure, and curriculum, and for being very categorical that it's better that we adopt the Western model when it comes to structure and then have our own models for the purpose, curriculum, and pedagogy. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahajan. And next we have Mr. S. Gurumurthy.
Good afternoon to all. A couple of days back, I saw on Twitter in which Mrs. Kiran Bedi and me had been mentioned as two non-academics talking on education in this ThinkEDU conclave. Anyhow, she is out of this panel at least. You know, to stand before a hungry audience and lunch is not a very good experience, but still I have been asked to talk the last. See, the idea of higher education is something which I will look at it from the psychological perspective. There are 4 quotes which I will read from an article, What Drives Success, which appeared in New York Times on the 24th of January, 4-5 days back. For the 2013 school year, so-and-so high school offered admission based solely on a standardized entrance exam to 9 black students, 24 Hispanics, 177 whites, and 620 Asian Americans. Thus, while the American kids overall had SAT scores 143 points above the average in 2012, Asian Americans kids overall had SAT scores of 143 points above the average in 2012, including 63-point edge over whites. Indian Americans earn almost double the national figure, roughly about $90,000 in the median household income versus $50,000 of the national average. Yet, in a study of thousands of high school students, Asian American students reported the lowest self-esteem of any racial group. This is the critical point. I will relate my experience in IIT Bombay in 2010 when I had been asked to address one management conclave, where a speaker ahead of me spoke about how India had been a failed society, a failed economy. So much so that we knew about prosperity, standard of living rise, and we achieved anything, whatever we achieved was when globalization lifted us our morale and performance. And he went ahead to say that till then we had only what is known as the Hindu rate of growth. Many people do not know how this terminology, Hindu rate of growth, came into our public discourse. In 1978, Professor Raj Krishna, who had been an advisor to the government of India, he was asked a question that we are following the same socialist policies that socialist countries follow, but they are able to achieve a better rate of growth than us. And you are an advisor to the government of India. You have been an advisor to the government of India. Why is it the same policies are not working as well as it should be working in India as it is in the East European countries and Russia? He said, what do we do? The same policies can't work here. We can achieve only the Hindu rate of growth. You know, I don't know whether he said it very seriously or he wanted to escape giving a responsible answer. Robert McNamara took this, he was the World Bank president. He took this term and spoke in at least half a dozen conferences, appealing for aid for India, a country which can never develop on its own, and it will always be dependent on the world. That is how India was branded. I was to speak next. The entire audience stood up and clapped that industrialist who spoke. It was a very brilliantly made speech, assisted by many economists and others. And when I said that this 1978 description of India has been completely demolished by two researchers done, one by Paul Byrock in 1983, who said between 1750 and 1900, the world economic picture showed that in 1750 India was number 2 and China was number 1, with 24.5% of world's GDP, China 34%. And both China and India crashed in 150 years to a total of 8% between them, China 6.2 and India 1.8. This set off a huge uproar in the West. Could it be that in 1750, India and China had a better standard of living than Europe? They couldn't tolerate it. So the OECD countries formulated a research under Angus Madison, the greatest economic historian ever. And 18 years of research by him, in 2001, he came out with a World Economic History, a Millennial Perspective, in which he gathered the entire economic history of the world for 2,000 years. India was number 1 in the first year of the Common Era. In the 10th century, 14th century, 15th century, India and China were equal. 16th century, China was ahead. 17th century, India was ahead. When I mentioned this to the IIT, they knew nothing about it. IIMs knew nothing about it. That we were a highly performing nation. That Marco Polo spoke that the Indian vessels were at least 3 times bigger than the Greek vessels. That in India, in the Egyptian Roman parliament, the economic advisor to the Roman Empire said India was looting them of their gold. In 1934, the Bank of, the Organization for Banks, which is in Geneva, it published a report that between the 14th century and 19th century, almost 20th century, India's gold accumulation was 14% of world's gold production. That means that was the export surplus of India. These are all recorded, proven data, which has not entered into the academic domain. It has not entered into the public discourse. With the result, the psychological preparation needed for India, which is one of the largest emerging economies in the world, which is acquiring a place of its own, it lacks self-esteem. The purpose of higher education is to prepare Indian citizen for global role. And I think there is a huge missing link in that, which must be addressed and addressed very, very carefully and with plan. And the public discourse has to change. It is not that just the academic atmosphere needs to change. There has to be an overall effort. The media has to play a role. The government has to play a role. The intellectuals have to play a role. And it is not that one particular wing of the stakeholders of education begin doing something. That kind of approach is not good. China has taken to Neo-Confucianism as the modern projection of China. Nihon Jinron is the principle of modern Japan. In 1991, the United Nations University asked the Japanese Institute of Development Studies to give a paper as to how Japan, from being an importer of technology, became an exporter of technology. And they produced 20 volumes, 11 of which was translated into English. The first volume contained a reference to how Japan leveraged on its empirical talent. Without going for any higher education, they upgraded their empirical talent to build shipping industry, to build a textile industry. How Japanese weaving was faster than their spinning, and so they had to import spinning technology from India. Nothing is taught in Indian universities. It's not known in the public domain. So I feel the psychological preparation that is needed to prepare the higher education students, not just in their syllabus, not just in their expression. We have a certain culture, we have a certain way of approach to life. The entire Western model is based on rights. It has its own aggressiveness, but it also produces a socio-economic model, which you see, the families are over. The elders are not being taken care of by families. Infirm people are not being taken care of by families. There is no family. But in India, if you say the same situation were to emerge, because the public discourse is about rights, no talk about duties. Rights sans duties. What will happen to India? 60 crore people in India are being taken care of by the families. 7 crore are the unemployed graduates who are being taken care of by families. But the higher education doesn't even recognize this cultural merit. It doesn't even reinforce this. And we are talking about gender rights. It is based on gender conflict. But in India, we have fostered gender harmony. In India, nobody had any exclusive rights, whether it is the individual or any gender. But higher education in India doesn't get into any of these issues. So I think we need to have a session only on what is the psychological, cultural, philosophic approach to higher education other than simply skill building. Skill building comes on its own. I will now just read out what the Economist magazine wrote about how Germany has been able to put up an economic performance, a technological performance, and as the manufacturing core of the world. What it says is, it says it is 350 vocational training models which has lifted Germany into a highly performing economy in the world. And the Economist magazine says that the Germans do not believe in useless university degrees. It is a very extreme statement. But there is truth in that statement. You know, Germany doesn't have management schools. Japan doesn't have great management schools. When we talk about West, we are actually talking about the Anglo-Saxon West. Continental West and Anglo-Saxon West are not the same. Because of our English language, our colonialism, our conceding superiority and accepting cultural inferiority, intellectual inferiority, we have not been able to look beyond the Anglo-Saxon nations. It is better that we come out of it, look at Japan, look at Korea, look at Taiwan, look at even Malaysia, which has upgraded and certified empirical talent. How many of us know 80% of the plumbers come from one district called Kendrapara in Orissa? Complete ignorance. I think we must educate our educators about India, and there I think something has to begin with the media. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. In your characteristic style, tracing the economic history of India, which for many of us is actually a thing that was unknown till now, he also stressed on the need for understanding the indigenous models that the Indian education system has, and that has to recognize the socio-economic underpinnings of our country. So we have another 5 minutes before we conclude this session for lunch. So we have time to probably take 2 or 3 questions. So I would request. Okay, first gentleman here, and then some at the back. Yeah. You can ask. I'll repeat the question. I'll repeat the question for the benefit of the audience. You can just shoot the question.
It's very appreciative model of this program. I think so many seminars on education has been going on in the country for so many years. But I'm sure what I heard 20 years before, I'm hearing the same thing. Same problem, same issues, change of education is not taking place. Could someone tell me anything good has taken place in the last 60 years in our country about education? Very frustrated. I think I cannot live for another 100 years to see the goodness. Any good thing has taken place in the last 60 years?
Well, actually, if you're asking that question, this seems to be answering itself, because if that's a question coming from the public, that what's a good thing happening, I'm not aware of that at all. But this is too vast a question. You really have to split your question up into different levels. I don't think we can ask a blanket question like, is nothing good happening in the country? We had the former session was all on primary schooling and RTE and various things. I can only mention 3 innovations again that you might want to look forward to address some of the challenges that have been mentioned here. One of the speakers talked about the community college model and the need for skilling, and one of the new policies on the anvil that is supposed to address this whole question on the disconnect between skilled workforce and employability and the relevance of education is the community college model. What 400 such colleges very soon, and so that's one thing you can hopefully look forward to. That's one. The other thing which is coming up, and I spoke a lot about the whole emphasis on integrating research and in science, engineering, and technology with the development goals of the nation. So a lot of work is started off afoot on that.
Can I ask one question, please? Can I ask a question?
Just a minute, let's finish.
Well, okay, I'll just stop here. So we can have a whole seminar can be held on this question. And I thought I should confine myself to just 2 things, the skilled community colleges and integrating research and technology.
But I think most speakers were stressing about character, leadership, attitude, patriotism.
Yeah, that's
what's going to happen for that?
As he shared, it's a host of requirements that it's not just the role of education institutions alone to provide solutions for the country's problem. The education institutions are definitely a part of the solution. Another thing is the role of private institutions in the higher education or even the primary education is also for public good, and that's something that's transformed the education space in the last 60 years. I think the role of private institutions also has transformed, and that's something that's good to the country. So I saw one lady there at the back. Yeah. I want to be gender neutral. No, I want to be gender neutral. So we'll take the question from the lady there and then.
To start with, I'd like to answer this gentleman. Sir, I may be half your age. The biggest change that's happened is I'm sitting here with you attending the conference. So I'm sorry about my throat. My question actually is, we keep talking about the whole concept around skill building, higher education, etc. I don't know if you're really answering the question of how do children, kids, youngsters actually choose their higher education, and that I think is the fundamental question before we even go into the quality of higher education that we have in the country. Simply because, to my mind, we choose our education by the process of elimination. We look at how well we did in our school, what marks we got, what colleges will accept us, what my immediate exposure and my peer influences. We are not really addressing these fundamental issues, but we are having a discussion.
Okay. Got the question.
Yeah.
So you want question pointed to anybody specific here? Anybody? Okay, my quick response to that question is, today, every student who's just trying to get into the higher education is aware of all the information, has all information in public space. So let each student ask this question: what is the purpose of the degree certificate that the student wants to earn? The purpose, is it just to exit campus or enter life? If the purpose is to enter life, what sort of a life does the student want to undertake? And if the student is able to get a right answer to what sort of life he or she wants, then probably he or she will get the answer to the question what sort of education he or she deserves. So you want to add something? No, just a question, not a question paper, please. Just one question. So
Hello.
Please, last question from a student there. Just last question.
I want to ask one question, please.
Please, we'll give the students also the chance. I want to be as diverse as possible, and then we are going to break for lunch. I can take as many questions as possible during lunch.
My name is KV Karthik Subramanian. I study at the School of Law at Shastra. Sir, my question is to Gurumurthy. In all secular countries over the world, have incorporated in their educational system the teaching of their own native values and culture, be it the Middle East, Europe, any of these countries. But why is it that only in India, our own values, whatever it is, Hinduism and Hindu values have never been taught? If secularism is going to be your answer, then, sir, I think such secularism is only working against the future of our nation because westernization of education has clearly taken place?
In India, secularism means rejection of Hinduism. The international organization whose name I forgot at that time is Bank of International Settlements.
Thank you. That effectively ends the panel discussion. A big hand to our panelists and our chairperson who've really taken us through a very interesting session. We're going to have a quick lunch break, but before we get Mr. Chawla back on stage, I'd like to remind you that we will regroup at 2:45 p.m. sharp at 2:45 because we've got our next panel discussion lined up, and the topic for that discussion is private education leads to public good. We've got a fantastic set of speakers who will make sure that they keep you wrapped with attention. Now I request Mr. Chawla to hand over mementos to our current panel members. Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam, our chairperson. A gentle round of applause if you will. Ms. Amita Sharma, Mr. S. Gurumurthy and Ms. Savita Mahajan. Thank you so much for being here. Can we have a group photo opportunity with the entire panel? Ladies and gentlemen, I once again would like to remind you that we will begin the panel discussion sharp at 2:45 p.m. So I would request all of you to regroup by 2:40 p.m. so that we may begin. Thank you very much and have a good lunch.